and welcome to this edition of Talking Europe. Just a few days to go now to the UK's referendum on EU membership. As polling booths there prepare to open, a survey suggests that public opinion is still neatly divided on the issue. In this edition, we're going to talk to two men on opposite sides of the debate. We start here at the European Parliament in Strasbourg. So first we're going to speak to the leader of the UK Independence Party, UKIP, Mr. Nigel Farage. Thanks so much for taking time to talk with us. Well, we're now just a few days away from that all-important vote on June 23rd. How confident are you that the Leave is going to take it?
Do you know, if you'd asked me a week ago, I would have said publicly that I think it's tight, but privately I would have thought Remain would probably get it. Not by a huge amount. At the minute, put me up against a wall and ask me who's going to win, and I will say and mean Leave. Overall,
we've talked a lot about different themes, migration, money, but why do you want specifically the UK to pull out of the EU?
That's easy, because the best people to govern Britain are the British people themselves, and we should do so through the ballot box. You see, you can't be an independent, self-governing nation and a member of the European Union. That's impossible, because right back to the Treaty of Rome, you know, we sign up to European law and European courts being superior to ours.
The UK can veto what's happening in the EU. It's one of the 28 member states.
Not many left. Both my parents, mum and dad, voted for the common market because firstly they believed it was about trade, and secondly they were told anything against the British interest could be vetoed. Now that has been through the single market, which sounds lovely and fluffy like a small Labrador, but actually has been the means of political integration.
The single market, and that's one place where I think the Leave campaign is slightly divided, because a lot of the other campaigners calling for a Brexit say, you know, are telling voters not to worry, that they're not walking away from that single market, they're not walking away from a market of 500 million people.
I think we need clearer definition on this, and I agree with your criticism. I think one or two on the Leave camp have not been clear enough about this. Every single country on earth has access to the single market. Every single country on earth. It just depends on what terms. Okay. Now, what we joined for 40 years ago was tariff-free access to the European market in a post-war world where tariffs were very high. Because of globalization, those tariffs are now very small. So any benefit we derive, from being in the single market through tariff reductions is outweighed by our net contribution and the cost of regulation and everything else. So my argument is, even if we had a fractious 2-year negotiation with the EU post-leaving, and even if French wine producers were so stupid that they didn't want to sell their products in Britain anymore, and German car manufacturers decided to get rid of their best export market in the world, and we said, right, no deal, we're going to put tariffs on British goods. Even the worst case scenario, I think, is better for the British economy.
The OECD, the London School of Economics, PricewaterhouseCoopers, they all disagree. They say that Britain would be poorer off if it pulled out of the EU. And, you know, a lot of people pointing out again that 45% of British exports go towards that EU market.
It's not actually. It's just below 40. Let's call it 40%. Look, is Europe an important export market to the UK? Yes, of course it is. But we're a much more important export market to France and Germany. There are French elections next year. There are German elections next year. I mean, you know, what would Monsieur Hollande do if suddenly, you know, French wine faced a big tariff coming into the UK? He'd be upset, and by the way, so would I.
Let's be really clear about it. Do you envisage a UK post-Brexit outside of the EU still part of that single market?
No. I don't want to be. As I say, the single market sounds innocuous. It's not. The single market is really the engine of political union. And make no mistake, I love Europe. You know, I adore your country, and here we are. But I genuinely do. And I've worked for French companies. I've traded in Germany and Italy. I love Europe. This Parliament can't propose legislation. This Parliament can't repeal legislation. The unelected Europe.
So in a way, it needs to nearly be more power to the people in Brussels, or less.
Interestingly, when Giscard was overseeing the Constitutional Convention all those years ago, I did say that if he was bold and he democratised the European Union, he might just catch a mood amongst the public that said, OK, these institutions are going to be legitimised. They didn't do that. They kept with the old methods. And I now think democratic reform now of these institutions, I think is impossible.
Now you say you love Europe, you've worked with a lot of different European countries. One wonders what will happen, however, to all those European workers in the UK, the ones already living and working there, if the UK decides to vote leave.
Let me be clear, we've let far too many people in. Way too many people in, and particularly too many unskilled people in, because it's amazing. In the UK last year, we created nearly 500,000 jobs. But 80% of those jobs went to EU citizens. I mean, there is something wrong somewhere with that. Now, there are some that say, well, all British young people are lazy drunks. Well, I don't actually quite believe that, although we may see one or two at the football over the summer. But I just don't quite believe that. Anybody that has legally come to the United Kingdom is there legally, and nobody in their right minds would even suggest changing that. Of course not.
Polish Europeans working in the UK
because that's a contract. That's a contract that we've made as a sovereign. It's not one I would have made, but we've made it and we must honour it. But going forward from here, I want to treat EU citizens the same way I treat Indian citizens, the same way I treat Canadian citizens or Australian citizens. Namely, that if you want a point system. Well, what it says is that you have to have a trade or a skill to bring to the country so that you can make a real contribution to the community. What it also says is if you've got a criminal record, you are not welcome, and that you have to bring your own health insurance for the first few years.
That, however, would be reciprocal then. Brits living abroad would be faced with the same kind of issues.
Most of those Brits that are in the EU, some are working, but most are actually retired. If I'm a British citizen living in Brittany and I need medical treatment and I go to your fantastic health system and get treated, you then send a bill to the British government. The British government pays the bill, the British government pays their pensions, so they've got nothing to fear at all.
How would being outside of the EU actually make the UK safer? Because you're not part of Schengen, you do control your own borders, that's not going to change.
Thank goodness we're not part of Schengen. Even the boss of Europol, who is a very pro-EU figure, estimates that up to 5,000 jihadi fighters have got into the EU in the last 15 months.
At the same time, there's also claims that there's been something like 1,000 arrests, 1,000 people brought to justice in the UK thanks to the European arrest warrants.
We don't need a European arrest warrant. We could just have straight deportation. France and Britain were discussing deportation treaties back in 1815.
Bilateral deals?
Yeah, exactly.
But how would you physically make those borders safer?
Well, we have to show resolve. I mean, this is about attitude of government. That's clear that we need someone other than Mr. Cameron. The other big question that comes up is, you've got a border at Calais, and France wouldn't continue that if you weren't in the European Union. Well, actually, that British-French deal is a bilateral deal. It's a deal, of course, that the ferry companies want and the train companies want.
How confident are you that the EU won't, if you like, punish the UK if it decides to vote leave? Make an example of that country, an example to others of what not to do?
If they punish us, Hollande will lose the election and Merkel will lose the election, because the German car industry and the French agricultural lobby are so big, so strong and so powerful, they will not want access to the UK market to be damaged. It's plain common sense.
OK, Mr Farage, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Lovely.
Well, we're now going to go to London to speak to someone on the other side of that Brexit debate, a former Europe minister. We've come to London and we're meeting with one man who has written 2 books on the issue, Brexit, How Britain Will Leave Europe, and even more recently, Let's Stay Together. Mr Denis MacShane, thanks for taking time out to talk to us. Now, you were a Labour MP under Tony Blair's government, a former Minister of Europe. You clearly hope that the British voters will vote to stay. Why?
I want us to stay in because it's crazy. Historically, I'm a historian, whenever Britain isolates itself from the rest of the continent, it usually turns out to be a disaster. We depend enormously on foreign direct investment, and if that dries up, and it will if we leave the European Union, the single market, we are in trouble.
Well, that's a big question, the economy, and there are a lot of economists. I mean, Roger Boodle wrote a book, The Trouble with Europe. There's Dyson, one of your most successful businessmen. They want the UK to leave. They say that will be better.
Out of Europe, we lose European citizenship, we lose the single passport for our banks, our financial sector, our professions, and then we'll be in trouble. And we'll still have to have the same regulations that irritate people, because that's just what a democracy does.
The UK Independence Party, that party led by Nigel Farage, that really wants out, and that's the basis of its existence. They say that the UK could trade, it could have agreements with the Commonwealth, which they say gives 17% of global world product.
We've been discussing as a nation for 7 years with India reducing tariffs on whiskey. The Indians are saying, we'll give you much lower prices, or we'll remove the tariffs on Scotch whisky, but in exchange you must allow all Indians to come to England visa-free. And then UKIP put up their hands in horror saying, oh no, we don't like immigrants. In Europe we've got a market of half a billion people, mainly middle class, a lot of problems with the European economy, we all know that. Nonetheless, it's the richest bit of planet Earth covering so many countries, and I just think it'll be nuts to turn our back on it.
At the same time, the EU, the UK represents its biggest export market as well, so we can't ignore it. Surely you would get a good deal.
Sure, we're going still to be buying BMWs and Mercedes and French wine and foie gras and the rest. Of course, trade continues. Nobody's ever suggested anything other than that. But it's a question is the terms of trade. If, for example, we would like the same deal as Switzerland or Norway outside the EU, the Swiss and the Norwegians have to obey all EU rules, including those allowing free movement of people.
Now, looking at the cost of being in Europe, because that's often come up, those who want to remain, say UK, every household gives about £340 per year, but they get much more back in benefits. However, those who want out, say if the UK left today, they could stop paying a weekly sum of £350 million to Brussels, and the UK could pour that into its own industry, use it as it wanted to get its own industry up and going. Which do you think is better? Well,
again, that's simply wrong. The total EU budget is 1% of Europe's gross national product, not more than that, of which 50% comes straight back for farmer subsidies. So unless you're going to leave every British farmer and Scottish and Welsh farmer and Northern Irish farmer without any help at all, you'll have to find that money. And believe me, farmers are brilliant at lobbying to get more and more and more cash from the taxpayer. And then of the other 50%, about 3/4 of that comes back to countries. For example, we get the lion's share of grants from the EU for university research. And in the end, Brussels, if you like, the EU institutions have 15% or 1%. That's 1/6 of 1% to spend on whatever they want to spend. And the idea you can create a super state with that, or that somehow it not being sent, is silly. And again, throughout history, we've always had to spend so much money on the continent. It was called wars, it was called invasions, it was called sending armies, it was called occupations, it was called losing our men and women in battle. Now, yep, we pay a little price, we get peace, we get prosperity, we get security. I think it's very cheap, the amount of money and what we get back for it.
And indeed, when I read your books, definitely for you, from the start, the UK knew it was joining more than an economic union, that part of peace and community was always a part of it. But let's look again at Boris Johnson, and he's voicing opinions a lot of people had, one about this uncontrolled immigration. He says it's cutting wages for British workers.
We've had open-door immigration in this country ever since I was a little boy. When I was a little boy, about 1 million Irish citizens came to live in Britain. Every second Irish male had to leave Ireland in the 1950s into the 1960s because Ireland was so poor. We have a successful economy based on mass low-wage employment. Now, you can have a criticism about that. It's not been that bad, but we have never been able to have enough British workers to do that.
Britain has been part of the EU, since the 70s, for decades. It was around when it wrote the Lisbon Treaty. It was part of that constitution for the EU. Why now is it questioning its membership once again?
Because it's been a choice of one particular political party. In the past, I really do make this point, the Labour Party held a referendum when it was in government in 1975, a bit like Mr Cameron is doing now, and it won very easily. All the press was in favour, now all the press is against. Both party leaderships were in favour, whereas now the Conservative Party's in open revolt and civil war. But what happened? The people voted by about 2-1 to stay in, and the Labour Party turned around and said, we don't care what the people say in a referendum. And at the next election, the first election in opposition in 1983, the official Labour Party position was to withdraw, come out completely without a referendum. And we don't know where the Conservative Party will be, assuming we vote to stay in. If we vote to vote out, it's just going to be such political chaos and confusion for the next few years in the UK and in Europe. So in the end, you need leaders. I love listening to Mr. Cameron now, the last 15 or 20 weeks, make incredibly strong pro-European speeches. He sounds just like me when I was Europe Minister, or Tony Blair. And now suddenly Mr. Cameron realises how incredibly dangerous the bet he placed in 2013 that he could easily hold a referendum and the Brits would massively vote to stay in. He's not sure, he's worried, he's frightened, and he's now making very powerful pro-European speeches. I hope he keeps making them, assuming we do stay in afterwards.
Well, very final word then on that. We're coming up to that June 23rd election. Polls are really putting both sides neck and neck. How do you call it?
I'm very nervous. I'm doing a lot of public meetings. I always ask for a vote at the end of it, and it's usually in favour of Brexit. Now,
and that's even in London.
It's in London, it's in other parts of the country. So I was in the big university bookshop in the University of London. You assume university people are going to be pro-European. No, we had a vote and the majority was for Brexit. I'm still, at this stage, very apprehensive, and I remain very, very nervous indeed about the result of this election, referendum.
Okay, well, only time will tell. Mr. MacShane, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks also, of course, to you at home for having watched. That brings us to the end of this edition of Talking Europe.